Well, hello, friends. This is Casey Gwynn from the National Family Justice Center Alliance. We're happy to have you joining us today. We've got folks from all over the United States and some folks from Europe on the phone. So wherever you are, we say good morning, good afternoon, good evening. It's an honor to have you with us today for our monthly webinar. You'll see on the screen, if you're logged in properly, the instructions about listening in on this call, information about kind of the logistics of the call. All attendees are muted throughout the presentation, but you can send us questions on your toolbar in the webinar feature. So we're very happy to have you type in questions. I'm joined today in the Alliance offices by Natalia Aguirre, our Director of Technical Assistance, and Sarah Wee, who is our Healthcare and Health Services Program Associate. And we're very honored to have all of you with us today. There will be question and answer at the end of the presentation today from our presenters. We're very excited to have a team from Northwest Ohio joining us today. Both Sarah Warpinski and Laura Neufeld Weaver are with us today to talk about human trafficking, so we will get into the presentation momentarily. You will note on the screen that the presentation will be recorded and posted at FamilyJusticeCenter.com. We have an online resource library that's available to you and to the 11,000 members of the Alliance. You can access this later if you want to listen to it with a team of people or with folks from your agency or elsewhere. And we do have an evaluation component. If you're willing to stay on and complete it after you complete the webinar, we always appreciate that and getting feedback from you in the process of improving the webinars that we provide. As I mentioned, my name is Casey Gwynn. I serve as the President of the National Family Justice Center Alliance on behalf of our CEO, Gail Strack, and our whole team. We're very happy to have you joining us today. We always give a shout out to our team. Gail calls it our small but mighty team. We have a couple of folks that provide direct services in the San Diego Family Justice Center. We oversee client services and case management, and we oversee the civil legal clinic at the Family Justice Center. But most of our work focuses on providing training and technical assistance and planning services for developing and operating family justice centers around the world. We do a lot of subject matter training and investigation and prosecution of domestic violence. We run the Training Institute on Strangulation Prevention, which is a very exciting initiative that focuses on training professionals on dealing with near and non-fatal strangulation cases in both the context of sexual assault and domestic violence. We do want to thank our sponsor today, which is the U.S. Department of Justice. The U.S. Department of Justice Office on Violence Against Women provides us a technical assistance grant to focus on supporting federally funded family justice centers and all the allied agencies that work together in the 85 family justice centers around the United States. So we appreciate B. Hansen and Susan Williams and the whole team at OVW for their support over the last really almost 10 years now as the Family Justice Center movement has developed and evolved in the United States and in other parts of the world. A couple other mentions. I do want to give a shout out to our upcoming international conference, which will be April 2 to 4 in 2014 in San Diego. You can actually pick up the hotel there on the far right of your screen. It's at the San Diego Hilton Bayfront Hotel, and it's a beautiful spot, and we're going to have folks from all over the world joining us. We always encourage teams to come to our conference. We really like multidisciplinary teams to come so that whether our focus is on strangulation assaults, it's on family justice centers, it's on investigation and prosecution of domestic violence or sexual assault or trafficking, or many other areas that we focus on at the conference. We really want people to be working together, police, prosecutors, advocates, mental health professionals. If you don't know about our conference, I encourage you to go to FamilyJusticeCenter.com, and you'll find on the flash screens on our homepage more information about our conference. We've already got people registering, and we're going to have a great turnout next April in San Diego for our conference. So please plan to join us. I do want to give a couple other shout-outs before we jump into the trafficking piece. Some of you know that we've been running for 10 years a camping and mentoring program for children exposed to domestic violence and trauma-exposed adults both. And that camping program expanded into a statewide initiative this year in California. We even had some folks from Oregon and Idaho join us as well. And we just received the published independent evaluation report from the University of Oklahoma about the impact of camping and mentoring on trauma-exposed children, and it's very exciting. We have posted that report in our evaluation file, in our online resource library, and if you have more interest in that, please feel free to reach out to us. But we're very excited about what's going on with Camp Hope, and we really hope to see it eventually become a statewide and then a national initiative where we really look at how to use camping and mentoring with victims of trauma and abuse, whether it's domestic violence, sexual assault, human trafficking, or others that are kind of caught in the crossfire of this vicious cycle that we see in oppression and suffer a lot of impacts that they can really sort out when they have a chance to get out into nature and be away from the trauma that they're experiencing. I do also want to mention we have an upcoming strangulation training course. It's a multidisciplinary course where we encourage a team to come, a police officer, a prosecutor, and a medical professional. That course is in February in San Diego. We just reserved the hotel for that, so if you want more information about that, please go to our website as well, or you can go directly to our Reg Online page at regonline.com/strangulation. And I just want to advertise a couple quick things. We have a free smartphone app for iPhones called Document It, which is focused on documenting near and non-fatal strangulation assaults. I say it's free because it's still in beta testing and we're adjusting it. We'll be charging for this app starting in January. We've invested about $100,000 in cash and in kind in developing it, but it's a very powerful tool that advocates and civil attorneys and even law enforcement officers are starting to use to document near and non-fatal strangulation. So please feel free to go to the App Store if you're an iPhone person and download Document It, which is how you would search for it as well. And you'll find this great tool for working with victims of near and non-fatal strangulation assaults. And then finally, lastly, we just published a new book in partnership with the California District Attorneys Association that is focused on the investigation and prosecution of strangulation cases. It's in both a printed form and in an e-book format, and we're going to make it available to prosecutors across America who would like to adapt it and create their own statewide manual. We have 37 states now focused on near and non-fatal strangulation, and if you want more information about that, please reach out to us. And then just finally, one last reminder, our webinar is being recorded today, and we will make it available in our online resource library. If you go to FamilyJusticeCenter.com, click on the Resources tab, and then go to Resource Library, you'll be able to find the webinar for downloading and for later viewing by yourself or with a team of others. We are providing California continuing education credits. Those credits are available. We provide the webinar for free. The certification for the credits does cost money. If you're a California resident, you can simply do that online. But in most states, you're able to take our CEU materials and download them and then submit them for certification and get CEU credits for this webinar in your state. So that checklist for how to do that will be provided and emailed at the end of the webinar. So let's jump right in. We're very honored today to have Sarah Warpinski and Laurel Neufeld Weaver joining us today for our webinar on human trafficking and a particular focus on their work in Northwest Ohio. Both Laurel and Sarah have extensive background in this, but I do just want to mention real quickly their background because they're both very impressive. Sarah is a graduate of Michigan State University College of Law. She is working now as the Human Trafficking Protection Project Regional Coordinator. She is not just a law school graduate, but she's also a Skadden Fellow. She's got a great background having done work in the Child Exploitation and Obscenity section as an intern in the U.S. Department of Justice and working in the Civil Division as well in the Office of Immigration Litigation. She worked at the Immigration Law Clinic at Michigan State University. And I will just say about Sarah, I got to spend a lot of time with her this weekend as we were submitting a national grant application focused on using the Northwest Ohio model of trafficking services and connecting them to family justice centers as really a potential national replication model where we use the Family Justice Center model in order to address trafficking victims. That's one of the big focus areas right now. The discussion is, in the trafficking world, do we have to reinvent the wheel? Do we have to create a service delivery model from scratch with all that we know from the child abuse and domestic violence and sexual assault movements? Or can we build alliances and partnerships? And so Sarah and I just finished that this weekend working with Pam Heyman and a team of agencies, a whole bunch of agencies in Northwest Ohio. So we're honored to have Sarah with us today. Laurel Neufeld Weaver is a graduate of the University of Illinois at Chicago. She went through the Jane Addams College of Social Work. She is a licensed independent social worker. She's currently working as the Rape Crisis and Anti-Human Trafficking Program Coordinator and a trauma counselor for crime victim services of Allen and Putnam counties in Northwest Ohio. She too has a very impressive resume, having worked as a rape crisis coordinator, having done a lot of teaching and a lot of background in social work. So as we dive in today, I want to welcome Sarah and Laurel. There's a lot of people doing really exciting work in trafficking. I would identify probably Nancy O'Malley and the team at the Alameda County Family Justice Center in Northern California, and this team in Northwest Ohio is two of the leading groups in the country focused on how family justice centers intersect with the needs of trafficking victims, both crisis services and long-term services. But we're very honored to have Sarah and Laurel join us today. So Sarah and Laurel, welcome. I'm going to turn it over to you, and we will dive into our presentation. And just as a reminder to our attendees, you can type in questions as they present, and we'll be doing those questions at the end of the presentation. So Sarah and Laurel, welcome. It's great to have you with us today.
Thank you. It's great to be here today, and so we're going to begin a journey together that we've entitled Identifying and Serving Victims of Human Trafficking Through the Family Justice Centers, a rural family justice center approach to collaboration. And some of us in Northwest Ohio have been on this journey for a while, and one of the things that we've learned is how important it is for us to be able to, as a community, come together with the different pieces. So we're going to move forward. You did a really nice introduction, so we're not going to spend any more time talking about who we are. Just to let you know, this is the voice of Laurel.
And I'm Sarah Warpinski. It's an honor to be here with you all today. So today in our discussion, we are going to be focusing on 4 main objectives. And this will be, we hope, engaging for you and hopefully interactive with, as Casey mentioned, the question panel that's to the right-hand side of your screen, and then we will also have an interactive poll during our presentation to hear a little bit from all of you. So our 4 main objectives are, first, to bring us all to a common basic understanding of trafficking, specifically focusing on the similarities and distinction between trafficking and domestic violence, recognizing that some of you, maybe many of you, have a domestic violence background in terms of the population you currently serve. And then we're really going to be looking at collaboration in how we can identify and respond to trafficking victims and who are those partners. We will also be examining best practices for collaboration through kind of a 4-phase model that we have put together. And then finally, we will look at how a collaborative model like the Family Justice Center can be optimally utilized to identify and provide comprehensive services to victims of human trafficking. So let's start with our basic understanding of trafficking. So it's often called modern-day slavery, as you may have heard that term thrown around about trafficking. But the essence of it, if you can remember one thing about trafficking, the essence of it is exploitation. Trafficking is when a person exploits another person for their own benefit. So this happens in a lot of different ways. And our federal definition, which is what we'll focus on because we are from a variety of states across the U.S., our federal definition looks at the means used to traffic individuals. And really it breaks down to, these are essentially the ways that one person is entrapped to continue doing something against their will, and those means are force, fraud, and coercion. So what the main emphasis of trafficking is again, like I said, on these means that compel someone else to do something that they don't want to do. So essentially, human trafficking victims, because of our federal law, can fall into 3 categories. So real brief overview of this. Under our federal law, we have the first category being minors. Any minor who is engaged in any kind of commercial sex act is a victim of human trafficking. Commercial sex act meaning in our law that that a sexual activity is exchanged for some kind of benefit. It's the benefit that's key here. It doesn't necessarily have to be money. But regardless of consent or the minor saying that it's voluntary, if they are involved in a commercial sex act, they are a victim of human trafficking under our law. And then the second and third categories are speaking more so about adults. So the second category is any adult who engages in a commercial sex act because of force, fraud, and coercion. And then finally, we have labor trafficking. And labor trafficking is essentially when someone is compelled, again through force, fraud, or coercion, to engage in any type of labor or service against their will. So that's our basic breakdown of our trafficking victims. Now, we hope today to make that a lot more concrete for you. Because we recognize that right now in the United States, identification of victims is a real challenge. So to put a little bit more detail to it, our 2 categories of trafficking break down into labor trafficking and sex trafficking. So labor trafficking can include actually essentially any type of labor or service. But what we see most commonly is domestic servitude, when one person is forced to work in another person's home. We also see trafficking in factories, sometimes called sweatshops. We see trafficking through begging rings on the streets. We also see it in agricultural work, mining, and for some of our more international examples could include brick kilns or child soldiers. And the mind can just kind of go on, thinking of different ways that people may be exploited in their labor. Sex trafficking, perhaps what's more commonly discussed in the media and discussed even among our service communities, sex trafficking includes the areas of prostitution that is compelled through force, fraud, or coercion, or pornography, stripping, any type of sexual activity, including even lap dances or exotic dancing. So it's really a broad category. And then another major thing that we see is mail order brides or child brides who believe that they're marrying someone just for the purpose of marriage, and in fact are taken advantage of after that marriage occurs. So that's a really fast overview of labor trafficking and sex trafficking. Now, when we are talking about modern-day slavery, it can seem like a very overwhelming, large problem, and partly because it is an overwhelming, large problem. We know that, and these numbers have been floating around, quite honestly, for probably 5 years now, that after drug dealing, human trafficking is the second largest criminal industry in the world. And when we say the second largest, we're talking about a $32.1 billion profit for traffickers each year around the world. So we're talking about a massive industry here, and it does affect every single country around the world and every single city, every single state in this country as well. So that $32 billion, to just put it in perspective, is more than the annual profit of Google, Starbucks, and Nike combined. So it is a big problem. However, what we are here to do with you today is to really help you to focus in on the individual stories and the individual situations that we need to, as service providers and law enforcement, we need to identify so that we're able to provide the services that are necessary. Laurel?
So we wanted to start by kind of giving you a few brief ideas of some of the stories that we've either heard ourselves or have heard from our collaborative partners in this work of working with survivors of trafficking. The first scenario is Michael, and he has had a difficult journey and reached out for help. He ran away from his boyfriend who had been forcing him to engage in commercial sex. And we really wanted to highlight that that trafficking is not privy to one gender or one group of gender identity or individuals in terms of their sexual orientation or their sexual practices. Trafficking is something that impacts people of all ethnic groups, all ages, all classes, and we know that it's even in all cultures. Another one is Allison. She called the National Human Trafficking Resource Center, which we're going to provide you some information about today, for some help. Her boyfriend was psychologically abusing her and forcing her to sleep with other men. We're going to encourage you today to think a little bit out of the box in terms of thinking about that maybe some people that you've interacted with that present themselves as domestic violence survivors or victims really, in fact, also have elements of trafficking happening in their life. Or Pilar, she called the National Human Trafficking Resource Center for a motel and explained that several years ago she married her husband, had 2 children with him, and when her youngest was 1 year old, Pilar and her husband moved from New Mexico, where her family lived, to Texas. After moving, her husband became abusive, and eventually he began forcing her to engage in commercial sex. So we know that intimate partner violence can be a tool that's used to manipulate and control people into trafficking situations. So one of these things that all of those people that we just looked at their profiles have in common is another word that we want you to take away with when you learn about trafficking, and that's vulnerability. Vulnerability is what makes someone be a person that is sought out, is searched out, is chosen for being a part of trafficking. And some of those common factors that we've seen in our community and that research has identified is persons that have experienced child abuse and domestic violence. And that's really what this conversation is about today, because so many of us that do this work are working with survivors of domestic violence. And if we know now that that vulnerability of being a victim of domestic violence makes people at higher risk for trafficking, shouldn't we as a community have some response and readiness for this issue? Another issue is poverty and neglect, where basic needs are not met. Here in Northwest Ohio, we've seen a large number of trafficking cases in large cities where we have large urban populations with large poverty. I think of a case of an 11-year-old girl who talked about how she found herself on the streets being trafficked when she was 11 years old as a result of coming from a situation of great poverty and where there was drug abuse in her family. And it really was a survival skill. She was looking for a way to survive that situation. Very often, we also see a pattern of sexual violence. As a rape crisis coordinator, that is what has brought me to this work. We have to see rape crisis as being an integral part and a solution to the issue of trafficking in our community. And if I know that survivors of sexual violence are at greater risk for trafficking, that profoundly changes the way I do my work. Another area that we're just beginning to learn about, I just sat at a meeting this morning and we were talking about the 165 runaways that we have a year in our little county here in Northwest Ohio, that runaways or thrown away kids are incredibly vulnerable to trafficking, and specifically domestic minor sex trafficking. If you also then come to the next one, this is a whole nother presentation that we could do today specifically on undocumented or persons that are unfamiliar from the community. You think about that in terms of vulnerability, a person not having the right paperwork to live in the United States. And in fact, the case that we're going to use as our case example for the rest of the session today is a person that didn't have proper documentation. So, and then, not surprisingly, but the last category of vulnerability, what large percentage of persons with physical, development, or learning disabilities are at greater risk for trafficking simply maybe on the basis of the believability when it's reported or when someone shares. Sorry. Okay, so one of the things that all of these situations that we've shared with you have in common, and this was actually a tool provided to me at a training that I went to on collaboration in San Francisco this past spring. It's the idea of looking at all trafficking, whether we're looking at labor or sex trafficking, to understand, first of all, what is the process that's being used to bring that person into trafficking. And Sarah did a really good job of saying to you there's three things we have to remember: force, fraud, or coercion. But what does that look like in terms of the practicality of what it looks like when someone is being forced into trafficking, or threatened into trafficking, or tricked into trafficking? How does that person arrive at the job? How is the job application given to them? And then the second element that we look at with trafficking is the means. So what happens when that person arrives in the country at their destination? We know that the United States is not only a destination for trafficking, but also a sending of trafficking. There's also the question of what happens when they begin their work. I was working this past week with a family that had a child that was communicating with her trafficker for 2.5 years before it changed from what this child experienced as just a friendly person to the switch of being a traffic situation. So how does that grooming kinds of behavior, that creating that place for taking advantage of that vulnerability happen? And then the end piece is, what was the person paid, how often, specifically when we're talking about labor trafficking, and then did the person leave? What happened when they tried to leave? Was there elements of coercion, threats that were used? And then lastly, is the person afraid of their employer? And when we understand these elements, one of the things that's really important to keep in mind is that people in a lot of situations that are being trafficked do not identify themselves as being trafficked. They are normalizing their situation, and a lot of people that I've worked with are simply trying to survive and are responding to what's happening to them in the best way that they know how. So let's take this story that we're going to continue to revisit, and we'll just very briefly give you a scenario about Isabel. This is a real situation that has had the names and information changed to protect for confidentiality. And for our purposes today, we're going to keep revisiting the different places that Family Justice Center has had an opportunity to interact with somebody like Isabel. So you will receive a copy of this at the end of the seminar. So Isabel is 42 years old. She was born in a country in Asia. And she came to the United States with a legal visa for a visitor's pass. And once she was in the United States, she was hired by a wealthy couple, and we're going to give them the name John and Peggy Miller, to take care of 3 children. So this would fit in labor trafficking with domestic servanthood. And so Isabel, she spoke English. She had learned it in her home country. She had education about mid-level. And John was a successful business owner. And Isabel, the process that she got to this trafficking situation is that she had heard about a nanny position from a friend from church. So the initial time where she got a connection with this family came through a place where she trusted, where the information was given through some church friends. The woman in this story, of the owner of the household, Peggy, didn't work much, but she had a lot of outside jobs and things she did in the community. And they had 3 children. They were ages 10, 8, and 3. And Isabel began working with this family with enthusiasm and dedication, and she was really excited because she had her own children in her home country that she could send some money back to. And so there was a beginning stage of where this seemed like a really good experience for her. How much did she get paid? She was offered $1,000 per month, And for Isabel, this was an incredible lot of money, and it made a lot of opportunities for her. They also provided her with room and board. And during the first 6 months, it seemed to be going well. There was a list of pretty substantial jobs that she had to do around the house. And she very quickly found herself growing close to the children, because the children were people that she really liked and she cared about. And she spent a great deal of time with them. Meanwhile, she was still making friends in this new country, including some friends at church. And some of the church friends were the first people that became aware that Isabel wasn't getting a lot of time off. And this started very gradually, and in terms of there kind of being a switch that happened at one point. And for her, this really happened when one time she got very seriously ill, and her employer, Peggy, dismissed her symptoms, refused to allow her to go to the doctor. And this is where we see a switch for Isabel, where she begins to worry and wonder, well, what's going on here? Is this the perfect job that I thought it was? And as the story goes on, and you'll receive a copy of the full story, this escalates through time to where Isabel is no longer being given any salary, no time off. She starts to withdraw, breaking the ties from friends and from family so that she doesn't leave her job. And then the means of which this turns into a trafficking situation is when Isabel confronts her employers about some of these changes and asks if she could have a couple more days off. They simply state, you're weak and ungrateful, and it's simply, if you want to go home, we'd be happy to do that. We'll simply call immigration. And so there's a vulnerability, because by this time she no longer has the paperwork to be remaining in the United States. And so this escalates to a point of where Isabel has some friends at church that really are concerned about this, and they become advocates for getting her out of that situation. And where we start to intersect with her in terms of domestic violence is when Isabel befriends a church member who has a brother who begins a relationship with Isabel. And that relationship is eventually identified as a domestic violence situation, where Tomas, we're going to call his name, befriends her, actually rescues Isabel from a trafficking situation. She moves in with Tomas. The relationship becomes very violent, and at this point she's sent to the hospital with an injury. And then comes the Family Justice Center. A brochure is given to her, and Isabel, for the first time, finds out about the Family Justice Center. So please remember that as we visit together this story.
So we are going to start now with Isabel's story as kind of our journey, if you will, through the phases of how family justice centers and other collaborative approaches, other collaborative models, or even just service providers might interact with her. So we have 4 phases that we have creatively named. They're not actually that creative. Phase 1 is identification. Phase 2 is safety and needs assessment. Phase 3 is collaboration. And the last phase, phase 4, is long-term empowerment. So in phase 1, the real challenge where we get stuck most of the time is in identification. When a person is identified as a domestic violence victim, what does it take to uncover the fact that they may actually also be, or they may have been, a trafficking victim? So identification to us includes 2 things. First, effective screening, and second, thinking outside the box. So in this situation, Laurel, what happened to Isabel? With each of our phases, we're kind of going to take a look at what happened to Isabel. So here, how was Isabel identified?
Isabel was first identified when she went to the Family Justice Center, and there was somebody trained at the Family Justice Center on a screening tool for identifying human trafficking. And when they took her history and they had an understanding of her past situation, that was the first time where it emerged that she had been in a trafficked domestic situation.
Thank you. So how did that screening tool look? That's what we want to walk you through here. And we do have in the materials that you will have access to, I think it's in 24 hours after the presentation, you will have our Ohio screening tool that we use. There are screening tools for almost every state, and there is also nationally a screening tool through the Polaris project. Now, a caution about screening tools. Everybody listen up really carefully to this. So a screening tool does not mean that you need to have every single one of the warning signs. These are really issues to kind of talk around and just listen for threads of these throughout the story that the potential victim is telling you. So we can see potential warning signs in both sex trafficking and labor trafficking. Now, I'm just going to walk through those really briefly. These are the general warning signs for human trafficking. Now, very important to note, human trafficking is a little bit of a misnomer because trafficking in and of itself does not actually require movement. So although sometimes a person being moved can be part of the trafficking, as we see even with Isabel's story. She actually came to the United States herself and she applied affirmatively. She applied for a job. She was not moved by the trafficker, so don't let that throw you. But one of the warning signs for sex trafficking actually is that a person is moved from place to place to provide sexual services. In addition, for sex trafficking, if the person is talking about traveling frequently to a number of different cities, or if they have often run away from home, those can be big warning signs. In addition, one of the things that we see most commonly, and actually that I would say I've seen in nearly all of the sex trafficking cases that I've worked with so far, is when someone has a boyfriend who is much older than he or she is. The key essence here for both sex and labor trafficking is control. For some reason, the person that you're speaking with doesn't have control of their own choices. So for example, of when they're going to leave, when they're going to eat, when they're going to go to the bathroom, where their documents are, where they're going to go, they don't have that control. So that's probably one of the big keys to pay attention to. They may have signs of physical abuse or sexual abuse or starvation. They may also have ongoing medical conditions that have not been treated for a very long time. Those can be common tip-offs as well. Finally, for both sex and labor trafficking, often the person that you're speaking with won't have access to their own identification, their identifying documents, whether they are an American citizen born right here in the United States or whether they are from a different country. So in both cases, they may not have that access. For labor trafficking, a few other kind of different warning signs that you might see. The first we do see in Isabel's story, where she lived, she was actually kind of required, it was included in her job that she had to live at her workplace. And restricted movement is another very common element. In addition, working with a large group of people in a very small space and even having very limited safety precautions, limited access to medical care, all of those things might be signs that there could be trafficking going on. And then finally, working long hours and not being free to leave the employment is very key, again, going back to that issue of control. So oftentimes when we talk about modern day slavery, the question that we come to is what makes this person not be able to walk away? And that's where we get very similar to our work with domestic violence victims. That's where we start to see this power and control. And it oftentimes is psychological and coercive. It doesn't necessarily have to be a physical threat. So that's very important to remember as well. Now, narrowing in a little bit, kind of focusing our lens a bit to domestic violence, I wanted to just share with you a bit about what trafficking could look like in an intimate partner situation or a family relationship. So, and this is, again, this is very much based on some situations that I personally have encountered in my work here with the Human Trafficking Protection Project of Legal Aid, because we oftentimes have seen individuals who sometimes drugs are involved is a common element that we have experienced, but where a child or a girlfriend or a spouse, in the cases I've worked in, is actually basically used by the partner or family member as payment for receipt of drugs. So the drugs there are the exchange, and the person is forced through oftentimes threats or domestic violence type of control to engage in that activity against their will. So how can you spot this type of trafficking situation that goes kind of above and beyond domestic violence, even though there also may be domestic violence going on? So we've just listed here some questions for you to kind of read through, and these are not questions designed to be asked verbatim, literally to the victim, but just things to kind of think through. One that is particularly, I think, important is this first one under sex trafficking. Did your partner or family member ever ask you to engage in commercial sex in order to help the family? Another very common one, skipping down to the bottom of sex trafficking, the sex trafficking list, did your partner or family ever withhold financial support or restrict access to your children? And this is also something that we see commonly, that that is a threat that's used in order to compel someone to engage in some type of commercial sexual activity. That somebody saying, I'll take custody of your children, or I won't provide you with money for their medical care anymore, or I won't provide you with rent assistance anymore, something like that. So those are some of the examples. Now, in the labor trafficking category, there are a number of different ways that we can see this happen in the context of a family. One question is, were you able to access the money that you earn while working outside the home? And that can often be the simplest, easiest way to kind of identify that you might have a trafficking issue going on. If someone is compelled to work and all of their money is given to another family member. So for the sake of time, we're going to kind of keep on going at this, moving on from our intimate partner and family trafficking. Now, what we'd like to do here, this is our first interactive portion. We do really encourage you as we are going on to submit your comments and your questions, but right now we're going to have a poll. And what we'd like you to do is just select yes, no, or unsure in answer to this question. Have you ever identified a potential victim of human trafficking in your work in affiliation with a family justice center or other collaborative agency, whatever agency you work with? So please go ahead and vote now. We'll give you just a couple of minutes to check your answer. It is really helpful to us in proceeding with our discussion of services and collaboration to have an idea of who among you has already identified victims or worked with victims of trafficking. So go ahead and vote. Now, keeping in mind that identification often can be informal. We aren't only talking about kind of a formal screening or a formal referral from law enforcement for a human trafficking case. This may be just in more of a casual conversation. You may have been working with someone as a domestic violence survivor for a period of time, and one day in your conversations with them or as you're coordinating services or counseling to them, you might realize that their story is actually showing a lot of signs of trafficking. So our poll results say that 59% of you have identified a potential victim of human trafficking. So we actually are working with a well-informed group here who already knows how to identify. And we are extremely encouraged by those results because, as I mentioned earlier, recognition of trafficking is one of the biggest challenges that we see across the U.S. still at this point. So thank you for that. Let's continue talking a little bit about identification in the context of a rural family justice center. I'll just be really brief on this because we are going to, when we talk about collaboration, we're going to talk about some of the different programs and models that we are working with right now. But in the rural context, for those of you who are in a rural situation where you may have one court, one judge, small law enforcement, and kind of a close-knit community where connections are really, really important. We have in our Rural Family Justice Center, we have found that one tool that is, well, two tools really that are just crucial for us is first having an advocate network. And what that means is basically all of our advocates across 7 counties, all of our crime victim advocates, prosecutor-based, law enforcement-based advocates, or domestic violence program advocates, sexual assault advocates, we all have a network together regardless of what organization we are employed by, and we meet once a month to every other month to discuss some of the cases that we're seeing and really to continue to grow in our understanding of how trafficking and domestic violence occurs in our communities. So the key advantage to this is that advocates, in terms of identifying trafficking, advocates already are, as you know, if you are an advocate, receiving those referrals for domestic violence and are working hands-on with domestic violence survivors. So as Laurel mentioned, since domestic violence survivors are at very high risk for trafficking, this is a crucial connection. In addition to the fact that one of our primary vehicles for identification has been through strengthening our domestic violence county-wide task forces, because that's an occasion in which we have our law enforcement advocates and service providers and medical providers all coming together to talk about how to improve our services for domestic violence victims, which again provides us the perfect opportunity to figure out how better to identify trafficking victims within the population of domestic violence victims. So moving on, the other main element that's very important to change in our identification tactics is really thinking outside the box, kind of challenging some of our preconceived notions.
As you look at this slide, we've presented some different ways of thinking, or in social work terms, we call it reframing, in terms of thinking about people that we have encountered in our work that might have intersected or have some connection to trafficking. And I especially want to direct your attention to the second one, which is child prostitute, or reframing to talk about commercial sexual exploitation of children. We have found that it has profoundly changed our work when we've eliminated the images and ideas that go around child prostitution. If I was to ask each of you listening to this webinar to just in your mind for a moment make a mental picture of a child prostitute or an adult prostitute, it's very likely that we come up with a pretty negative image. And we don't necessarily, in that, adopting that image, really connect to the exploitation, to the vulnerability, to manipulation, to the threats, to the force, to the fraud that was used to engage both children and sometimes adults in this kind of work. And so we really, as people doing this work, need to think outside the box and think about the person that's sitting in front of us. Is it possible that they indeed are a victim of sex trafficking? And the last one is domestic violence or sexual abuse victims. Is this really a human trafficking victim? And I want to spend just a little bit of time at looking at how those things are similar. So the commonality between trafficking victims and victims of domestic violence and sexual abuse, this is not information that any of us out there listening are not familiar with, but maybe we just haven't made the connection in terms of what we're seeing as being a similar story. All victims can be anyone, whether those are children, women, men, as we said earlier, any nationality, socioeconomic status, race, age, and faith. No one is exempt from becoming a trafficked person. We know in battering and in domestic violence that the weapon that's used in those relationships is a weapon. The weapon is trust. There's a trusting. There's a relationship. There's a relationship of trust with that person, and that abusers and traffickers often threaten victims in compliance through violence, domination, seclusion, intimidation, and constant proximity. It probably, to you listening, you can think of particular incidences where those tools are being used. And victims experience frequent acts of violence across a long period of time. Very often in trafficking, there's a repeat kinds of violence, kinds of behavior that's happening to that individual. Again, trafficking persons are not, they all are involuntary. They all violate a person's freedom. The perpetrators use that relationship of trust. They take advantage. They take advantage of that vulnerability. Both victims are often abused by someone who they consider to be their partners. The scenarios we told you earlier, no one in those situations was anticipating that a partner would switch from a loving, caring relationship that they might have modeled in the beginning of the relationship to one where they asked them to do favors or sold them to somebody else as part of their relationship. Often there are situations where victims utilize coping strategies, and there's a presentation that I do about trauma bonded, when there's a development of a position of attachment that victim feels. In that scenario I talked earlier about this girl that's been communicating with this guy for 2.5 years. Believe me, she is aligned with her abuser. Victims often normalize their behavior and their exploitation, and victims may not ask for help. If you don't remember anything today, remember that they do not identify themselves as being trafficked. So we have to do our work differently in engaging them in the tools and the things that we can offer within our collaborative efforts. And in some cultures, women are reluctant to seek assistance, especially when there's been sexual violence involved, due to that stigma or shame.
So that brings us to the end of identification. The second phase that we're going to focus on is safety, the safety of the victim and needs assessment. So what we think of as kind of our headliner for phase 2 is engaging the victim, survivor, with choices and resources. So again, very similar to what we do with domestic violence and sexual assault victims. So in this particular situation with Isabel, Laurel, what happened to Isabel in phase 2?
Well, there was a safety plan that was created by the victim advocate. There was a federal law enforcement investigation, again, with someone that had been trained to understand the trauma and the impact of being a trafficked person. There was contact made with a lawyer and somebody that had some education about victims' rights. And very importantly, Isabel was put in contact with some mental health and medical services that might be needed. So if we kind of think about in terms of a checklist that needs to happen from organizations, and we've also provided a checklist in your handouts, some of the first things, which again, not unlike domestic violence or the other crimes that we all work with, is the first fundamental need of safety and basic survival, simply meeting the needs related to food, water, and medical. Here in Northwest Ohio, we've really had to develop that collaborative response so that we have those resources available when people present. Transportation, physical needs, being part of rape crisis and having a seven days a week, 24 hours holiday response, and having a supply of clothing that we can take to the hospital has been wonderful for working with being able to provide some resources for trafficking persons as well. Access to justice, as part of our collaborative, we work with police, law enforcement, prosecutors, people in our community that can help move from these initial reporting of trafficking to the prosecution. A sense of belonging. A lot of times we see that people seek in a trafficking situation, they're looking for a place of belonging. And so really working at self-esteem issues and things like that. Another big area that we're just really learning about, and I'm sure some of the areas you have would even have more challenges in this area, is in the area of translation, especially when you're working with international trafficked persons. And then the piece that I come to the table with a lot has to do with what we know when someone has been repeatedly abused in a trafficking situation. There's a lot of trauma that occurs. And so specific trauma-focused, a lot of times cognitive behavioral care is needed for that individual.
You know, and that we'll talk about the trauma a little bit more later, but that is really key, I just have to mention, across all of this checklist. Because when someone comes to the situation, when the trafficked person comes to this phase 2 of needs assessment and they've suffered immense trauma, their access is going to be limited to a lot of these things. So especially the final 4 here, in the criminal justice system, we see a huge need, a great need for advocacy, partly because of the trauma that they've suffered. They need someone often to walk alongside them and explain what's going on and what their rights are. The area that I focus on really is the legal services. So both legal status in terms of if they are an international trafficked person, their immigration status, and then what we see frequently is that by the time that survivors come to us and are actually identified, they may have a very long criminal record. And so expungement of that record is crucial for them being able to move on with their life. And often that record comes because of the trafficking. And then we'll go into more detail later about the legal services that help them to regain control over their life. So, but right now, we just kind of want to pose a hypothetical question to you. Hearing what you have heard about Isabel, what barriers might she have to services? And this is kind of the meat, in a way, of what we're talking about, because what we so often see, why collaboration and services don't happen for victims, is because of the significant barriers that they have. So thinking about whatever field you work in, whatever your role is, whether you are a teacher, a social worker, law enforcement, if you're an attorney, if you do child care work, or if you are a community member or a therapist, any field that you are working in, if a person comes to you for services and they don't have their identifying information, full name, address, phone number, they have no license, no social security number that they can show you, they have no identifying documents, that's going to present a serious barrier to them getting your services. I'm going to just venture to guess that would present a serious barrier. In addition, when people do have a long criminal record or do not have legal status, there are legal reasons why they can't get services. And then finally, because of the factor that Laurel discussed about not self-identifying, that's going to be a big barrier to them getting access to the services.
So one of the large barriers that we've talked about a lot during this presentation is the effects of trauma. The fear, the anxiety that a person experiences in terms of really reaching out for help. And you have to understand sometimes how good traffickers are at giving messages to the people that are being trafficked in terms of not trusting people and in terms of especially not trusting people that might reach out to them for help. And so you all can read the list of different effects of trauma. We've, in our area, have decided that we need to do a train the trainer, specifically that focuses on the trauma that comes from being trafficked. And there's a whole new category in the DSM-5 about multiple trauma that has been initiated related in response to trafficking.
And as I mentioned just a moment ago, survivors often do present very complicated legal issues because of the criminal investigation or the immigration case that is going on. Timing is crucial. If you are, if you're listening to this webinar today and you are an attorney or a legal advocate, this piece is very, very critical for you to understand, and you probably may have already experienced that the timing is very delicate for safety reasons. If you are bringing, if the victim wishes to bring a civil cause of action of almost any kind, the timing and procedures that you use to protect them are going to be crucial. So moving on, because of lack of time, our third phase is collaborative services. This is basically about connecting the dots between all of the different stories, all of the different needs, all of the different agencies and people who are involved, and creating a victim-centered response. So here, Laurel, what happens to Isabel in phase 3?
In phase 3, the Family Justice Center enters the picture, and they ensure that she's connected to the services that she needs and to move her more towards independence. And really key in here is communication between investigators, advocates, counselors, attorneys, and other service providers. This collaborative piece is what created the Northwest Ohio Human Trafficking Rescue and Restore Coalition. 4 years ago here in Northwest Ohio, we were presented with a first case of a woman that needed, she needed shelter in our domestic violence shelter as a federal witness in a trafficking case. And we found as a community that we did not have a very good understanding of what her needs were, nor how to respond. And so out of that, a large collaborative, which actually incorporates 14 counties, we came up with a group of people that meet on a regular basis and are learning together with 3 focuses. This shows you a map of our counties presently that are engaged, and Sarah and I have been working on trying to identify which counties need more support, which one more autonomous. And the 3 goals that we have are to do public education around trafficking, provide survivor recovery, and a justice response. And so it's been very important to develop this collaborative effort in a formal manner. Just so you see how these counties fit into the larger picture, on the next screen is a picture of the coalitions across the state of Ohio. And each coalition has its own governing body, its own way of working at this work. But then we have a state anti-trafficking coalition that comes together to kind of report and to develop, hopefully, these white areas, counties that are not covered, will at some point be incorporated in existing coalitions.
And we do know that across the United States, in every single state, there are coalitions like this, whether they are rescue and restore coalitions specifically or other types of task forces and coalitions. They're a crucial partner to have at the table, and that's actually what brought me to start the Human Trafficking Protection Project. I was a member of the Michigan Human Trafficking Task Force for the last 3 years while I was a law student, actually, and had the opportunity to really learn about the importance of collaboration. And through that experience, I learned about the Family Justice Center and got connected here in Northwest Ohio and I essentially proposed with Legal Aid of Western Ohio and the National Skadden Fellowship Foundation, I proposed a project that would essentially work on identification of victims of trafficking and would improve their access to free civil legal advocacy and legal services. So the main goal of our project, we actually work very closely with the Northwest Ohio Rescue and Restore Coalition because the crux of what we do is collaboration, because when you have a victim that you are in touch with, and you may be the first person that they've told their story to, they have some crucial immediate needs like we talked about on that checklist, and you need to have the people, the relationships already in place to provide their access to the things that they need at that moment. So the other big thing that we do is really work on educating victims about what their rights and their legal options are. So we do this in the context of the Family Justice Center of Northwest Ohio, which some of you may have heard of already or be familiar with. It was one of the first family justice centers founded back in 2006, it was officially founded. And it is kind of a unique family justice center because it's rural. this is a Family Justice Center that is a collaboration of agencies across 6 different rural counties. So essentially each county has a host organization, and one part of the Family Justice Center is hosted in each of those counties. But all of the counties get together to provide the services and travel to where the victim is in the county that they are located in to provide those services. So we are integrating human trafficking identification and services for victims into our 6 Family Justice Center counties, in addition to 4 others, partly through crime victim services. So now let's pause for a moment on why Family Justice Centers or other collaborative organizations that focus on domestic violence, why they are the perfect partner for identifying and serving victims of trafficking. So the way that I see it, as in my background as a social worker and as an advocate prior to law school, already people who work with domestic violence and sexual assault victims understand polyvictimization. You understand the importance of working with multiple systems and the complexity of developing a victim-centered approach. You understand the crucial importance of confidentiality and privacy for the victim in order to keep them safe, and you also are experienced in safety planning and crisis response. And then the understanding of crime victim rights is also critical because trafficking victims in almost every state have been incorporated into the crime victim rights statutes. And then finally, and most importantly, from my perspective, is that a lot of what we see with trafficking, the same reason that trafficking victims remain trapped in their situation, is that same power and control cycle, essentially, that we see with domestic violence.
So this brings us full circle to our last phase. But first I want to ask you that question. How might collaboration improve the victim's safety, prevent future exploitation, and empower the victim to achieve full recovery? I know that in Northwest Ohio, we have found it incredibly valuable when there's so many of us sitting at the table sharing and talking about having a collaborative relationship which allows us to talk about a certain case and allows us to each bring our little piece of the puzzle to be able to provide a more comprehensive response to trafficked persons.
So our last phase here is long-term stabilization and empowerment, and this can take so many different forms because it is based on the individual needs of the survivor. So we talk about here commonly education, employment, and transportation solutions for them. Housing is a major, major issue. Across the United States, I'm very sad to report that there are actually, at this point, 0 beds, no shelter beds, no housing that is specifically available for male victims of human trafficking. It's a problem, though, for every demographic of trafficking victims. In addition, benefits, having access to benefits is crucial. Trauma counseling and prevention of future trafficking are also common issues that we look at. So Laurel, in phase 4, what happened to Isabel at the Family Justice Center?
In the last stage, she was fortunate enough to be part of a Family Justice Center that was part of a collaborative. And they came together to do a needs assessment of what kinds of community resources she could be connected to. And Isabel ended up going to college, and she was able to actually work with an attorney in obtaining a visa related to being a trafficked person, and she was able to stay in the United States. And eventually her children were also brought to the United States through a protection program.
So now my aspect here in terms of stabilization, the area that I really focus on as an attorney is the role of legal services in that 4th phase of stabilization and empowerment. So I'll just really briefly walk you through what that can look like as far as the kinds of needs and the kinds of tools that a trafficking survivor could actually use to empower themselves and have greater access to achieving what they want to achieve. So we do see self-sufficiency needs in terms of benefits, employment, housing access, and consumer remedies, sometimes including bankruptcy. Family legal issues are crucial as well. child custody and past marriage issues, whether the marriage was forced through the trafficking or whether the trafficking began in the context of the marriage, long-term immigration relief and expungement of criminal records, and then finally access to justice, representation, legal representation, so that the survivor, should they choose to do so, can actually sue their traffickers and anyone who financially benefited from the trafficking to regain some of financially what they lost through the trafficking. So that's kind of the end of our phases. I know it was really fast, but we want to equip you now, if you don't know already, about the National Human Trafficking Resource Center. It is a phenomenal nationwide organization that provides resources relating to human trafficking. Now, very importantly, it has a 24-hour hotline that is anonymous, and survivors of trafficking frequently call the hotline. Medical professionals, advocates, counselors, community members, anyone who thinks they may have encountered human trafficking or be suspicious of activity that could be trafficking is highly encouraged to call this number. And they can actually walk you through the situation. I personally have called a lot of times on situations. They can walk you through, think through, could it be trafficking? What are some other important things to learn? Who can you connect this victim to? Who can they talk to so that they can be safe? And the reasons why, really, not only does it connect you with local services and assist in this national collaboration network, which is truly a powerful tool, partly because of the mobility of trafficking victims, it also can provide 24-hour interpretation and translation services. If you have a victim, someone who you think may be a victim who does not speak English as their first language, it also helps tremendously with collecting data about the incidence of trafficking across the United States, and does help you to make that report to law enforcement, whether federal or local law enforcement. So we highly encourage you to call this phone number, 888-3737-888, whenever you think that you may have encountered trafficking. And please do give this number to survivors as well.
It's very easy to remember. It's repetitive, and so you put it into your phones right now, or you can memorize the numbers because of the way it is stated. I just wanted to say that it's been really great having Sarah come on board and working with her, especially in the area of legal services, because at Crime Victim Services, one of the qualifiers we always make is we do not provide legal help. And so it's really nice to know that you, through collaboration and through some of these efforts, we're able to absolutely offer a full response to trafficked persons. And as complex and as difficult and as how isolating as the issue of trafficking and how quickly it's developing or emerging in our communities, we have to have each other to respond to this issue. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Laurel. Well, at this point, in the spirit of collaboration and just wanting to increase our national collaboration effort around trafficking, we are really happy to open up to questions and comments that may have been submitted during our presentation. And we do have our contact information on here. We encourage you to contact us if you want more information or would like to discuss this further or have further questions for us. So thank you so much for the privilege of being here with you today.
Thank you, Sarah, and thank you, Laurel. This is Casey Gwynn again, and that was great. We appreciate you doing this and really framing a lot of very interesting work and thinking you're doing around this, and of course the crucial kind of core direct services pieces. I have a lot of questions. Our time is short, so I'm going to try to fly through some of these, and we'll do the best we can in our remaining 10 minutes or so. I hear from clients that they've done sexual favors to pay off a debt of a husband or a boyfriend. Is this sex trafficking? There's the first question for you.
Oh, sorry. It definitely could be sex trafficking. If there has been, in that sort of situation, if there is someone who they are exchanging the sexual favors in return for some kind of a benefit. If they have a debt that they're paying off and that person that they are indebted to is requesting payment in sexual favors, I think there's a good argument for this fitting the definition of human trafficking.
And this is Laurel. I think it's really important to look at the factors related to force, fraud, and coercion, even within an intimate partner relationship. And sometimes we as practitioners forget to look at that element in terms of how the law defines what trafficking is.
Okay. I'll keep moving here. Here's the second one. The federal definition of human trafficking doesn't describe those involved in commercial sex who may have been, quote, entrapped, unquote, when underage and who are unable to, quote, exit the life, unquote, due to vulnerabilities upon reaching the age of maturity. How do you define and categorize them?
I think that this is an area that is really quickly growing and developing, especially with the Trafficked Victims Protection Act that was passed nationally and then revised in 2005. Here in Ohio, we have one county, Franklin County, that has actually begun to look at what does a program look like that responds to women that have been charged legally with prostitution or with solicitation, with going through a rehabilitation program that then in fact expunges their record, recognizing that they entered prostitution at the age of 12 to 14 years old, really identifying them as a child victim. And so what exploited child. So what we're starting to look at is not what age a person is in prostitution, but what precipitated their entrance into it, and really beginning to understand that people are not voluntarily walking into this situation.
And then just from the legal perspective as well, in the federal statute, not the definition of trafficking, but in the criminal statute for sex trafficking, in it's 18 USC 1591. And in that statute, it does talk about, again, as Laurel is saying, the entry into trafficking. So if there was force, fraud, or coercion that initially put that person into a situation of commercial sexual activity, they would be a trafficking victim. And that's precisely why legal programs that are in our court systems that are essentially diversion programs and expungement programs are totally, they fit fully under our federal definition because it's really about the entry. Even though the participant who asked the question is right that the statute itself focuses heavily on minors, but it could also include adults who were initially trafficked as minors.
Okay. We have quite a number of other questions. Let me kind of frame these a little bit because they're in a variety of categories, but there's questions around addressing the needs of child sex trafficking victims if they do come forward and connect to your Family Justice Center network, and it has to do with child welfare mandatory reporting issues and how you deal with child welfare and mandatory reporting around child sexual abuse issues when they come forward. There's a number of questions about it, but the general topic is how do you deal with that, what needs to happen there, what should be going on in your relationship with child welfare. Is that an issue that you've addressed or dealt with?
I think that child welfare is one of the perfect places to start when we talk about reframing or renaming what we're seeing. In our area here, it's about educating child welfare on what is child sex trafficking so that they not only identify it, but they understand the complexities related to some of the cases that are coming across their desk. It's so important that they're part of these collaborative efforts. And they have a lot of limitations a lot of times, and we're trying to find ways to think outside the box, to be innovative in the way that we're working with these cases.
And state laws do vary as far as the mandatory reporting somewhat in terms of child sex trafficking. There is variation across the states. Depending on if one of the traffickers was a parent or guardian or not, which also can pose some interesting scenarios. But the other thing that is really, really crucial here is that when you do have a child who has shared a story with someone, a teacher or an advocate or someone else who's then making the report to Children's Services or Child Welfare, that person can really play a very big role in helping to explain, to frame the issue just in the way that they make the report that will make it a lot easier for children's services to intervene or do an investigation.
Mm-hmm. There's a number of questions around this whole issue of paradigm shift and the renaming, reframing. A fair amount of it has to do with this question of runaways. I know a number of years ago we worked with Manolo Guillen and a team of trafficking professionals in San Diego on a documentary called Indoctrinated that we did. I actually narrated the documentary. And we did a on-the-street study. We met with a whole bunch of young girls who were being trafficked in a variety of stables in San Diego where we were moving around. And we didn't meet a girl who wasn't a runaway. We had no foreign nationals in our study. They were all American runaways, and they were all kids coming out of child abuse and domestic violence homes. But interestingly enough, all reported as missing persons, were runaways by their parents or parent when they left home at a very young age, 11, 12, 13. Can you talk a little bit about the paradigm challenges and the policy challenges about dealing with runaways who are categorized in the criminal justice system and who are under the legal control theoretically of their parents before they run away? And can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, it's ironic because just this morning I was sitting at a protocol meeting for domestic minor sex trafficking in Allen County, Ohio, and we're racking our brains trying to figure out how do we successfully use some of the tools that have been given us by the state with new legislation related to diversion. And the thing that kept coming up is we feel like we're forced to put kids into juvenile detention centers. And in fact, these kids, we don't have any way to keep them safe when they're entered into a trafficking situation. And so we were all sitting around this collaborative talking about what can we do related to this. And one of the things that we kind of came up with is if 90% of runaways
We seem to have lost audio with Laurel and Sarah. I apologize for that. We cannot hear them. So we'll see if they might have muted themselves. I can't tell. But I do want to just comment a little bit on that issue. I think the thing that strikes me, this is Casey Gwynn as the kind of moderator here, the number of paradigm shifts and the system changes that have to happen are just unbelievably profound. This whole transition and paradigm shift from viewing the victim as a criminal when they come forward, I think those issues have to really be discussed in the Family Justice Center context. About half our Family Justice Centers in America are led by police departments or prosecutors' offices, many of which have some kind of a Public Records Act check before providing services. Many of which require identification of some kind because they're serving male and female victims, and they've got to figure out if there really is a predominant aggressor or if the abuser is pretending to be a victim. So I think those issues are really significant in looking at how do we screen people who do come in without an ID, how do we not do the records check. Let me just check in. Sarah, or are you back on?
Yes, we are back on now. So sorry about that. We're not sure what happened.
Okay. Yeah, feel free to dive back into that whole paradigm shift question. I think you were talking about the juvenile detention challenge.
Yeah.
And that's a real we've seen where we had a safe house here, but the kids also don't stay in the safe house either, especially the young ones that are drug or alcohol addicted. They're there for a while and then they get lured back into by their pimp or whoever's trafficking them. They get lured back because of the drug and alcohol issues, because of insecurity, and so those dynamics, juvenile detention versus a safe house versus how do you keep them, how do you help them, empower them to get out and stay out.
And so this is Laurel. So what I was saying was 90% of runaways will intersect with sex trafficking within the first 42 hours of running away from home. So part of what we have talked about in our community is we have to be about doing the work of intervention with runaways in a very profoundly different way and with a sense of urgency and immediacy. And so we really have to look at that question of safety. There's a lot of barriers related to what we know in research is in working successfully with survivors of sex trafficking, especially with teens, that choices need to be given. And then you impact this whole area of safety. And when you can't have them in a locked facility, because then it looks punitive. It looks like we're punishing them for being a victim of crime, for being manipulated, for being vulnerable. And so we as a community, and that might be where the national government is asking for creative ideas of what does this work look like when we don't address them as juvenile delinquents that have run away, but children that are leaving violent situations, looking for solutions that intersect with people that take advantage of those vulnerabilities.
This is Sarah. But then in the situations, the child sex trafficking cases that I'm working on right now, the challenge is really that they, because they have been so traumatized and manipulated, they are often still under the control of the trafficker. So that makes their interaction with our systems and their safety just that much more complicated, partly in addition because of the fact that they do have significant barriers to getting any kinds of services and getting into a safe placement, because if they are outside of the home, you know, they can't have access to the benefits that they, like medical assistance, which means they can't have access to getting into a shelter, for instance, or if they need a parent or guardian signature for something. It's very, very complicated where we are finding that paradigm shift between runaway juvenile delinquent to trafficking victim.
Well, we've got a number of other questions, this is Casey. We've got a number of other questions around this issue of drug and alcohol addiction. Mm-hmm. I will say that in the work we've done, we haven't interacted with too many child sex trafficking victims that don't have drug and alcohol issues. I mean, they're self-medicating, they're dealing with unbelievable oppression and trauma, and lo and behold, drugs and alcohol get involved, whether they started using them voluntarily or involuntarily at the beginning of the journey. And that, of course, you know, in a lot of community-based domestic violence and sexual assault agencies, not to mention police or prosecutor-led family justice centers, you know, somebody under the influence of drugs or alcohol becomes this very significant issue for service delivery. Can you just talk a little bit about that issue?
Sure. So that I would concur completely that in the victims that we interact with, we do see drug and alcohol abuse is frequent among them, not only in self-medication, but really as part of the trafficking itself, that was part of the coercive kind of whole I don't know, continuum of things that was used by the trafficker to get them to comply, especially initially. So that really becomes challenging because of the fact that addiction is long-term and affects so many different areas in which they're seeking services. So having the substance abuse recovery and counselors at the table is really crucial. I would say probably one of the most challenging things that I do encounter with victims that I'm working with.
This is Laurel. It's really important that the collaboration includes partners in the community that are drug and alcohol related services. And I think that's an area that we all need to do better work at in terms of not seeing it as separate silos, but the same picture of the same situation.
Did we answer that question, Casey? Can you?
Yeah, I think you have. I mean, I know it's a complicated issue, and it's not an easy issue. It's one of the things that I think is why it raises questions about, you know, whether or not a comprehensive wraparound trafficking center, kind of anti-trafficking center model, you know, is the better approach, or integrating them into existing family justice centers, because the change in the way intake is done in family justice centers has to be significant. The reframing and renaming has to be significant. And I think of people walking into family justice centers, in many cases where it's a police or a prosecutor-led center, this issue of having no identification and not really being able to articulate why you're there and not wanting to talk about it there's got to be a screening mechanism in place, because a lot of centers don't want to let victims inside the door, alleged victims or potential victims of crime, until they know who they are, especially if they're a male standing there saying, I need to talk to somebody. Well, that doesn't mean you get into a secure area where there are children and adult victims. I mean, so that the whole screening and having an external interview room where somebody can sit and talk to an intake person seems to me really critical, because in many cases they don't want to let them in the door if they don't know who they are. It's not like a private community-based domestic violence or sexual assault center where they're all set up to do that confidential screening in a safe, secure place. In a lot of centers, that screening is done behind security doors, and nobody gets behind those doors kind of till people know who they are and if they can figure out if they're really victims or not. So I don't know if you can talk a little bit about that, but it just seems to me there's a lot of thinking that you've probably had to go through in how you get a trafficking victim inside the network of your family justice center.
Well, one of the things that's happened in Ohio is that the Ohio State Trafficking Commission has identified child advocacy centers as a place where possibly some interviewing and entrance where there would be a beginning justice response could happen. And so our Family Justice Center will work in collaboration with the Child Advocacy Center that is already set up as a forensic-based place for interview, and sometimes it has even the forensic medical possibilities, as being a place where trafficking interviews with law enforcement can happen. But as we've begun these conversations, there is some reluctance in terms of when a law enforcement becomes involved, whether or not a person feels, safe to disclose what's really going on. And so that's been a big challenge for our community.
And I'll just emphasize too that because the fact that most of the time the survivors that we've interacted with, they do have criminal records. So there is they might be an offender in some area. They actually might be technically a criminal in some area, but they are also a victim of human trafficking. So a lot of, quite honestly, what happens with us right now is really relying heavily on outreach and collaboration. So a lot of the initial interactions that we have with people at this point are not necessarily within the four walls of the Family Justice Center itself, but there's outreach going on outside of the Family Justice Center in collaboration with some of our shelters and other partners. And then once we have kind of done that initial screening, then they're able to actually come in and be in the Family Justice Center. Now, is that necessarily the best approach? Well, no, not necessarily, but that's currently what we're doing because of how complex it is with their kind of multiple offender victim situation.
Well, that's great. I appreciate. We're gonna I think wrap up on that comment, because I think that's really the important piece. This is about relationships, both between professionals coming together and relationships with those who have been victimized, where we meet them as human beings and we work with them one-on-one, and we simply care and love them and offer a community that is safer and more respectful and more caring than the abusive situation that they're in. And that is our challenge in all of this. So, Sarah, thank you very much for your presentation today. Laurel, thank you. We really appreciate both of you and the information. I think it was just really great stuff, and I want to just say thank you. I'm going to put up your contact information for just one more moment. For those that are interested in reaching out, we really feel that the work going on in Northwest Ohio has real potential to really work through these issues, to develop a model, both rural, urban, and suburban communities, that could be a model around the country as we're thinking through how family justice centers can play a role in the trafficking work, just like Child Advocacy Center, thinking through those same complex issues, and community-based sexual assault and domestic violence agencies. So Sarah and Laurel, thank you very much. We're very honored to have you today. Thanks for joining us.
You're very welcome. Thank you.
So I'll just wrap up. Again, this is Casey Gwynn from the National Family Justice Center Alliance. We appreciate you joining us. If you're interested in our conference, please go to FamilyJusticeCenter.com. We will have a trafficking focus. Nancy O'Malley, the District Attorney of Alameda County, is going to be joining us. We're going to be doing some pre-conference work. The San Diego Police Department's trafficking team will be doing some pre-conference work with us on Tuesday, April 1st. So we'd love to have you there for the pre-conference sessions the day before the conference begins. We always put in a plug for 2 recent books that Gail and I have published. For those of you that are interested in the Family Justice Center movement, you can access those in our store at FamilyJusticeCenter.com. Dream Big is the kind of big picture book of the movement of collaborative multi-agency services, and Dream Big, Start Small is really the how-to. How do you merge agencies? How do you bring agencies together? How do you create a multi-agency model in working with trauma victims, both adults and children? So we want to thank you for joining us today. Blessings on each of you for the work you do in all of this. I know that this is work that is not easy, and I've been doing this work for almost 30 years now, and it's challenging, and you get tired, and sometimes it's great to be able to sit and listen to some folks that are doing exciting, innovative work to spur us on to greater work in the future. So blessings on all of you for your work. Thank you for joining us. Thank you, Natalia and Sarah and the whole team at the Alliance for putting this on today, and we wish you well in your work. God bless you. Bye-bye.